Welcome to the Interstice podcast, episode 2, available on Spotify and Apple iTunes podcasts, or on my channel if you're watching it there. We'd left off last time with Bowen Lakes, the incredible several-day journey of camping that my dad took me on when I was really young, as well as my brothers, and all the kind of wonderful and varied memories that came out of doing a trip like that. There are a couple that stand out as the goofiest, but hilarious in the aftermath of what occurred, sort of things that went down on the trip. One of which was where we decided to camp next to the lake, like directly next to, and it rained so much that one night that it was that sort of nightmare where somebody put your hand in a bucket of water, except as opposed to your hand, it was our feet. And it was enough rain that the water level had actually risen on the lake, and to the point where we had to panic, get up in the middle of the night and move everything up the beach so that we wouldn't be totally soaked in the morning. And then there was another time where usually we would always camp with our tents, and that was the way that you did it. But sometimes they would have these shelters or mini cabins that you would be able to stay at as you went around. And for one night, I think actually on that same lake, we found one of these and we decided, why not stay there? It'll be cool. And we went in and there was a wood stove that you could use, and there was a bunk bed, and everybody was deciding where it was that they were going to sleep. And there's something about when you're young, I think it's like the whole tree fort effect. I thought it would be cool with this bunk bed if I would be able to sleep on the second bunk. And my brothers were like, oh, yeah, for sure. You can take that. No problem. Of course, we'll sleep on the floor. And it was kind of it was foreboding, but in a way that turns into a comedy at the end, where there was all these carvings on the wall. And one of them, I believe, literally read, "Beware of paratrooping mice." And in the course of the night, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing it's because of how warm this place was that it attracted a lot of rodents. And by mid-evening, we had a fire lit for the whole evening. By mid-evening, they were literally falling from the ceiling onto my brothers. And for me, it was hell, because hot air rises and being stuffed up in the roof of this cabin, essentially, because I was on the second floor of the bunk bed, was intolerable. It was absolutely horrible. So not my fondest memory in terms of comfort, but one of the most hilarious in terms of the mice dropping everywhere from the ceiling onto my brothers and dad as they slept. There was also a outhouse. There's at every single camp, they're equipped with your basic necessities. You can dig a hole, whatever you got to do usually. But this one had an outhouse, and it was up behind the cabin. You had to walk up into the woods a small ways. And one of my brothers he went back there doing his business. And when he returned and he came back to the cabin, again, white as a ghost, pale sheet, and he was pointing back and he said there was a bear up there. And what had happened was, while he was going to the bathroom, while he was sitting up on the can, the bear went and walked by and poked his head, because this was a doorless outhouse that he was using. And the bear had poked its head in and looked at him, Welly, who was going to the bathroom. And I like to say that if it was having any trouble up until that point, that he no longer did. Everything would have come out smooth. So that was another instance where we came across bears, which was rarer than you might think, at least in any sort of significant context for me, where I know that my dad had come across them wandering around the camp before. He's camped enough that happens. And they're looking for food. This is one of the reasons that you have to lock everything up or put it out of reach. You got to be safe about that, because bears don't care. Bears are hungry. And if you're careless, then you deserve to be eaten. So there were a couple of those wandering through, but I never had that. It was usually, if I was going to see a bear, it was to observe it at a distance while you were out on a lake and you saw it wandering along a shoreline or something. But that was one of the closest that I had ever come, in the sense that my brother was just up the path from me, and that was pretty damn close. But luckily, the bear was well fed, and whatever my brother was doing had so offended the bear that he quickly departed after looking in on what he was up to. Other experiences there, I can't say. There's one really, really cool part, and again, it's kind of magnified the experience, was near the end. They call it a portage. A portage is basically where you have to walk, and you're going to have the lakes connected by a period of time spent on a footpath or something like that. But then there was these portages where it was so shallow that if you were in the canoe, that it would sink to a point where it would run along the bottom. So instead of that, you had to step out and you had to walk with the canoe, because without your weight in it, it would be able to pass over wherever it was that you were. And there were a couple of those that were really, really cool. These like overhung, interesting patches, almost marsh-like, that you would walk through, I remember. And I don't know if that was as a result of the time of year that we went, but I remember how frigid cold it was. It was also interesting to me thinking back at this time when you're 10 years old and how your perception of the world changes. And little details. One, obviously, was my appreciation of sugar. I wasn't allowed as a kid like a lot of snacks or anything like that were going to rot your teeth, all that classic stuff, right? And one thing was, if you went on this trip for energy, my dad would bring all these chocolate bars and I would get to eat them, which was amazing every many hours. And my favorite is Mars. I don't know. They don't have that actually in Japan here. So that's a little bittersweet, pardon the pun, because they have other good options that you can get, one of which is Black Thunder, but nothing compares to the old Mars bar of days of yore, which was so good. And when you're that hungry and you don't get a lot of chocolate as a child, it was incredible. The other thing I remember, which more relates actually to just how small I was at that time and how kind of physically incapable you are without even really realizing it, was in packing things up. I remember how hard it was that you had these little not containers, but bags, I suppose, for your sleeping bags. And I remember when I was that young, how incredible a feat it seemed to me that my dad was able to take one of these sleeping bags and he could just crush the thing into there. And if I were ever having trouble, he would help me out and finish off however much needed to fit into the storage sack. And I thought, man, how strong do you have to be able to do this? This was like a rite of passage as a man. It was that you would be able to pack well your own sleeping bag into these very compact, tight storage cases that they had for them, which is so funny because it's obviously nothing now. But when you're 10 years old, this was a bit of a challenge for me. Weak child that I was at that time. So moving along from the many different things that I did with my dad, we're all staying here in kind of like middle school, getting out of elementary school, the Pogs era, that kind of stuff. Magic cards, which of course I couldn't afford because they were so expensive for a kid. Every kid wanted to play, and it was all like Alpha series coming out at that time. I would have loved to. I remember all this negotiating with my brothers who'd managed to accumulate some cards, but it was never enough to make a complete deck. So you kind of vaguely knew what you were doing with them, and you could never quite do it. But magic cards, those were so cool. Those totally destroyed any excitement I had over Pogs. Pogs were very passé very quickly because magic cards were so incredible. Funny to think back, actually, it was in the 90s as well that when you think about how far VR has come at this point, that they had VR back in the day. If you go on YouTube now, you can check out the old VR headsets. I think of how cool paintball is in comparison to, they used to have laser tag that you would go and play, which was so without any sort of impact, was never really that exciting because you're like, I think I got him. You never really had any idea. I think it was just the adrenaline of being in the courses that they provided. These are the memories of the sort of like birthday party things that you were doing at that time. And beyond the birthday party stuff, hearkening back, remembering all of this, when I was in middle school, this is when I first got introduced to, basically in terms of like my younger life, the most formative in how it would play out in its entirety. Like I think basically the path that was chosen for me was as a result of what I picked up in middle school, which was rugby. This is a huge, huge part of my life where there was George Bonner Middle School. And so it was like grade 7 and 8 that would go there. And I came shortly after my brothers. I'm pretty sure my brothers were actually through, again, kind of hearkening back to that idea that they were just that much older than me that I would miss them when they were going on to their like next level of school. And at this school was a gentleman known as Ted Zinkin. And Ted Zinkin was the rugby coach for the school. And this guy is an absolute legend and figures so largely in the lives of so many kids from that time. So rugby on the island for that grade group had the Mid-Island Tournament. And the Mid-Island Tournament was both grades 7 and 8. And all the teams from up and down the island would be involved. And as long as Ted Zinkin coached at this middle school, they won. And I think he coached at the school for about 10 years. And every single year that he was there, he coached whatever team he had to go on to absolutely crush every single person that they competed against. Now, when my brother was there, he did really, really, really well. My middle brother, I don't believe my oldest brother didn't play it, but my middle brother did. And I was following in the success that he had there. And I was particularly lucky because I got even a bit more training, because when I was in my last year of elementary school, I believe we had, it was either Australian or New Zealand, and you would never want to mix these two up. But I think Australian woman who came to my elementary school, and she was really, really into rugby, and she wanted to introduce it to the school. And at first they were terrified that, oh, this is too violent a sport, this, that, and the other thing, right? But she persevered and she got it allowed at the school. And for 1 year, we probably only played about 4 or 5 games, something like that, and practiced a little bit. But wow, like what, I knew how exciting it was for me at that time. It was incredible. Nothing else figured like it. It was such an incredible rush. And there's no two ways about it. When I was younger, I'm a large enough guy at this point. I'm like 186 centimeters, pretty big guy. But I was almost always like that. I was always really, really large compared to the rest of my peers at that point in time. And so you can imagine this kind of size benefit that I had was really amazing. And not only was I larger, but because my birthday falls in January, it gave me this huge advantage in terms of being like the first age of that year when I was born. So I had a size and a year advantage on everybody that was involved in this kind of stuff. So I had enough skill, and I had definitely an excessive size. So I was doing really, really well. And by the time that I went on from my elementary school, having a little bit of training in rugby to start with rugby, once I had arrived in middle school into the capable coaching of Ted Zinkin, it was near fated with this guy's skill that we would go on to do really well. Like I say, 10 tournaments in a row every year that he was there. And our team did no different. We went undefeated. I believe in the 2 years that I played there, we never lost a single game. And you know that it so much has to do with the quality of coaching, because how could you can't repeat that on fluke. It has to be because you were that skilled. And it was, you could see it in the cohesion of our play together. It was so as one unit that we were able to move, and where momentum is such a force in rugby, the more cohesively you are able to move the ball along, the way that you're able to ruck, the way that you're able to line out. It made an incredible difference against everybody. It was like you'd think that we were 3 age groups older than anybody that we ever played against, and the scores that we got were ridiculous. It was something, we were beating people by like 30-0, 40-0, 50-0. We were stomping anyone that we played against, and it became like a running joke when I would get picked up after school with my mom, and she'd say, "How did it go?" And of course, we won again, and we won again. And he made you want to, like any good teacher, like any good coach does, he made you want to do better because he was such a great guy. He had such a great sense of humor. there was this thing, he always called it rugby hell. And it was basically to violate any one of these rules would send you to rugby hell. And they were all principles of the game that would mean if you played them properly, you succeed. If you didn't, you would go to rugby hell. Like if you ever run backwards, you go to rugby hell. If you ever, all these different things. It's hard for me to remember now when I think of how many years ago that I played, but it was so comedic, but it got locked so in your head. And if you went to rugby hell, they woke you up with a kick in the nuts. That was his line every single time. So he's always making you laugh. You never want to, and if you missed practice, you were always accountable to it. You're always accountable to Ted Zinkin in a good way that made you not want to let anybody down. And somebody like where that age time for people can be, it's really tough, right? When you're going through middle school, high school, basically as you're coming out of like the earliest years of elementary school and the social complexities of your life are really starting to amp up. It can be really, really difficult. And this provided me with an incredible grounding, I think, to have that kind of leadership from him, to have known success like I did in a difficult environment. This is earned success. When you're winning one of these games, it's because, as I say, you're working cohesively. It's because you've trained well. And running into anybody, it doesn't matter how big you are, it generally sucks. And so you learn to temper your behavior as a result of this sport, which was really useful. In no way was I or anyone else on the team perfect individuals, but I'm sure that this went a long way into forging us into at least half realized, half confident young adults as we went into things like high school and the sort of turbulencies that you come across there. And beyond this being some incredible, awesome experience for me where I got a chance to win and I got a chance to work with people in an athletic environment as a team, it went on to be something much, 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 much larger for me. So, as I said, when I started this, there is the Mid-Island Tournament, and it's this big premier event, kind of the ultimate conclusion of the season after you've played everyone. And this kind of like blip in reality, this little anomaly that's around Mill Bay, the place that I'm from, is there are two, if you're in the market for high schools, and junior high, I suppose, because they merged these two together, that they're two of the most like highest ranked premier international private schools that exist in Canada, exist on Vancouver Island and in close proximity to the middle school that I went to, the public middle school that I went to. I went public school all the way up to middle school. And they would attend the event, and they notoriously had great teams because they could afford them and they would actively recruit. Whereas we're this ragtag band of heroes come together from the local sticks. But in the face of such good coaching and everyone working so well together, when we went to the Mid-Island Tournament for both years, grades 7 and 8, we won both times undefeated and absolutely spanked our competition when we faced off against them there. And where it wasn't so much of a big deal when you were in grade 7, because, right, that's the younger age group. When we got to grade 8, and we were essentially graduating middle school to go on to high school, this is, I can't remember if I was playing flank or if I was eighth man at that point. I think I was eighth man. That was sort of notoriously my position, and one that I'm very proud of, because often eighth man will be the captain of the team. It's like a fairly prestigious position off the very back of the scrum, kind of like the leader of the forwards in some sense. And when I played there, big as ever, and we had done so well, so much credit goes to my team for making me look good, because one man is not an island when you're playing this game. I was approached afterwards by both coaches from the two private schools, and they were asking me, where are you going to go for your high school life? And I kind of laughingly said to him, and I did, this is no exaggeration, I said, well, certainly not, I'm not going to your school, because there's no way that I can afford that. And both the coaches hummed and hawed and were like, oh, okay, I see, And one of them very particularly was like, oh, well, that doesn't have to necessarily be a detriment to you coming. The school actively tries to recruit and help people who have different financial situations. And so I went for a meeting at both schools, and they're both like, they were both very kind and everything. I think if you had a comparison, one was a little more old school, one was a little more new school. I guess that's how I would compare these two. And it just so happened that the new school, I think, gave a better offer of, it was known as a bursary to my parents. So it's like a sports scholarship. They call it a bursary. And so there was the initial offer there, but then I went in to meet the headmaster of that school. And my mom always says in that meeting, because they were both there with me, that there was no way that I could possibly be more nervous than she was. And I thought, you know what, maybe she's right, because I knew the gravity of the situation was not lost on me. Like, this was a huge deal because these schools were so famous in the area. And I mean, if you compared the facilities of these places compared to where I would go and the reputations of the other school that I could possibly attend, it was significant, right? These were world-class private schools, and I was kind of destined prior to this to be in your sort of standard public school, which was like, it was okay, and would probably see me traveling a great distance to get to it because the public school that I would go to was not nearby. And I met the headmaster, and the guy was really, really, really cool. Actually, with the school that I ended up attending, I went to Brentwood College Preparatory School. Brentwood College? Yeah, that's right. And when I met him, I think his name was Mr. Ross, and he was one of these guys. He knew absolutely everybody at the school. He knew every single one of the kids by name. Now, I'm sure that there was some skill particular to him that was involved in knowing everybody's name, but it did not, to me, make it any less impressive that he was so personally acquainted and made that effort with people. And it was an interesting interview because he got right to work on what my strengths and weaknesses were, where when he started, we were in the headmaster's room or whatever, and he had asked me to do some sort of like basic mathematical formula. That was the first thing he asked me to do, and there was no way. I'm talking about my dad being an engineer, but for whatever reason, whatever I inherited genetically, it was not strength in mathematics. It's always plagued me how horrible, utterly horrible I am at mathematics. And so the interview was not starting well, I guess you could say. And then luckily, after we went through a few of those problems, he grabbed like a book from behind his desk and he said, "Would you mind reading this?" And I love reading. As we've well established, it was something I was exposed to very young and did a lot of personally, always going to the library to fill up some new bag of books that I would come back and burn through in a weekend, all young, short adult novels, stuff like that. But I did a ton of reading, and I think that really wowed him because he was impressed, definitely, how I was able to read this quite complex book that he put on the table. And when he asked me the meanings of words and what I thought of the narrative and what were the relationships that I read and what could I read into them from the passage that he had me look at, he was satisfied that, okay, he's not all dull and stupid after having had a look at the math. Because I think had the decision been made purely on my mathematic ability, there was no way that I was getting into that school. I was there and I was going to get a sports scholarship, but this was the sort of school, like a lot of these places, they have an entrance exam. I'm talking about before I even got to meet him, I had to do an entrance exam to get into the school. So they were very, very, very thorough about who was or was not going to attend the school. And lo and behold, after that meeting that I had with the headmaster there, I was invited to the school. I have no idea to this day what the bursary was, but it was enough that my parents were able to financially afford me going to that school. And this school was incredible. The facilities, like I say, were just head and shoulders above anything else that I would have ever experienced doing anything else. And it was interesting in this sort of, because it's traditionally founded on the British school system and British boarding school system. Think of it by rough parallel to something like Harry Potter, where I was a day student because I lived locally and I was not going to actually have a room there. And it cost way more if you actually wanted your kid to live there. And I lived about 10 minutes away by car. So there was no point in that. Although I was assigned a room as a day student, you were still assigned like roommates, and you didn't get a bunch of crap into their room, but you had a locker outside, and they were kind of ostensibly your roommates that you had. And I felt bad for them. Like if I did, sometimes they were generous enough. These two guys that I lived with, they have gone on to, they're like some of my closest friends in my entire life, and still are. Both have gone on to be very, very successful. One of them develops AI and like the sort of housing for AI that Google works with, and the other is working on green alterations to already existing buildings and offices, where he goes in and sees how they could rework their energy systems in the building to see how they could create less of an emissions footprint. And I am a elementary school teacher in Japan, so hey. But they're doing great, and they were really, really good roommates. Really amazing people, and I'm so happy for the successes that they've achieved at this point. So I got into the school. I was assigned to one of these very Harry Potter-like houses, and they all definitely had their own personality. There wasn't quite so clear and on the nose distinctions like these people were the smart people and these people were the stupid people. But each house had definitely a history associated with it from whatever kids were there before that created a sort of culture. There was the kind, actually, to be fair, the correction here, there was sort of the egghead house, and then there was a bit more of the jock house, and there were good and bad actors in each one, and so much personality packed in. And it was kind of cool for me because when I arrived, they've always been developing the campus here. Like if I go back now, I'm like, there's like 7 new buildings on the campus, all state-of-the-art crazy stuff. But when I arrived, they had designed a new building, Rogers House, and that was the one that I was assigned to. The Egghead House, that's where I was at. And I didn't know that, of course, until I arrived, but there I was in the Egghead House. And so excited to give again, like reference to how large I was at this time. When I was going in to the house, there were 2 wings. It came around like 3 rectangles, a wing out to the left, a wing out to the right, and then a rectangle around the other way. And when I went in, there was a new headmaster actually arrived as of the year that I got there, and I was arriving in grade 9. And when I was walking up to the front door, she said, "Oh, the grade 12 wing is down that way." I was like, "Oh, I'm in grade 9." He's like, "Oh, wow, you big bastard." So that was like first indication. It was still at that point large for my years. And I got stationed up in there, and it was when I think back of all the crazy stuff that happened because I was there, and I can definitely spend some time discussing it. So I had come to the school because of rugby. That's why I was there. That's why I was going to get the bursary and why I had any access to being in this school whatsoever. And I was into the rugby team immediately, but I gotta say, here is an example of where it doesn't matter if you're recruiting everywhere. There's got to be a certain spark, a certain magic that comes together where your coaching is just that good and the people who work together are just that good. Because the years that I was there, I played rugby for grades 9 and grades 10, and they were savage. And when you're getting bigger like that, it's rough. You're really starting to run into other big people. And whereas I had this advantage before because of my size, that advantage was slowly starting to dry up as others were catching up and the impacts were becoming more and more brutal. And I didn't want to do this so much anymore. I enjoyed it, but as much as I loved the sport and it was so much a part of my history, the varied, we mostly lost, I think, when I started up there. So the incredible legacy that I'd left behind was definitely that. It was just that. It was left behind. It was in the past, and that was difficult to come from. I think that was another sort of test of my personality, and that if you'd only known success, that how do you handle when things get turned around on you? And I think I did okay. I knew that I had to be at the school. I had to do this, but whether directly thinking about this or not, I would be open to the idea of doing something alternatively, but there was no way, unless I was doing something exceptional physically at the school, that I was going to be able to keep the scholarship that I had. So here is where my life once again took another 90-degree turn in terms of what it was exactly that I was doing. So at this school, it's on the water. Here's another detail of what makes this school so exceptional. I said that the town's called Mill Bay, and it is in the Bay of the Mill. That's where they have the school, and you're directly adjacent to the ocean, and the view is spectacular. It's so beautiful. One of my buddies, who actually ended up being that one of the guys who, like I said, was my roommate, he lived across the bay. You could see his house. So he could have been a day student like myself, but I think that his dad was sometimes there, sometimes not. And so he ended up actually boarding at the school. And because they were directly on the water, and because they have this reputation of being an old-timey British school system thing, they had rowing. Like the sort of Olympic rowing that you see with like 8 guys lined up in a boat, one of these little tiny skinny things, barely like 2 widths of like somebody's legs apart, incredibly difficult to balance. And they had that sport at the school. And not only did they have that sport at the school, but they also had, just in the way that Ted Zinkin was this legendary coach for rugby when I had been in middle school, there was this legendary Irish coach there who had been working with the school for ages and churning out Olympic athletes. Like, I believe of the years in operation that they were there, by the time that I arrived, there had already been 6 Olympic athletes that had come out of the school. And again, now it's at a higher level where you're recruiting, and so it's more likely that you're going to find somebody who's of exceptional physical ability and from anywhere in the world, because it's truly international. People came from all parts of the globe to go to this school. The chances were higher, but I have to think that it was a large part of the kind of coaching that was afforded by this Irishman. And for me, it was the ultimate way out, where I was getting sick of running into people, and without even realizing the sort of impact, pardon the pun, that this could have on you mentally if you continue to do high impact sports. Look at something like Joe Rogan talks about him getting out of jiu-jitsu. Was it jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts at like just the right time, because it really rattles your brain and gives you concussions. And then you have people in what is it? You have people who are in football as well, and people like there's movies dedicated to how concussions were ignored in the NFL and how this created a massive problem. I wasn't particularly thinking about how my brain would work in the coming years after I did this stuff, but I did know that continually running into hard objects was something that took its toll on your body. And so this was the ultimate way out, where if I did well enough, if I got onto the varsity crew, where I spoke with the, what would you call it, the student staffing commission, whatever you want to call it, the people responsible for admissions at the school, that's what it is. They said to me that, hey, if you can achieve a high level of success in rowing, then you don't have to do rugby. And so I jumped ship. Again, where these are all incidental. I'm not going for these puns. I jumped ship pretty fast to get out of rugby to be able to do rowing. And it was also really exciting, beyond not running into people that it was such a unique sport to be a part of. How many schools do you go to that have a boathouse? Not a lot that I'm aware of, let alone not only do they have a boathouse, but that they also, that boathouse is directly adjacent to the water. You don't even have to take boats to go and row somewhere. You walk out of the boathouse down to the ocean. Again, these sort of opportunities that I had there were crazy. And there was some magic here where you need quite a few people to have a quite exceptional rugby team. You need, how many is it on a field at a time? I believe it's 15 people on the field at a time, where with rowing, it's much more compact. To have an exceptional crew, heavy 8 is just that. It's 8 heavy dudes, and that's what comprises the premier boat in the school. And when I started fairly early on. I think I actually did rowing from grade 10, but in a sort of getting my feet wet. And only that. It wasn't really until, actually, what am I talking about? I'm losing some of my memory. I tried in grade 9, but it wasn't so serious in grade 9. And then it picked up in grade 10, and I decided to be way more serious about it in grade 10. And there was this reckoning that always came every year where if you're good enough and if you're in the varsity crew, you would go to the Canadian national tournament held in East Coast Canada in Ontario. The place that they have it is called St. Catharines. It's a big deal. It was a big deal back then. I think any school where you go to a national level competition and you're competing against the rest of the country is going to feel really, really intense. But to be able to do this, to be on the national level crew in the school, there's a big choice, because this was the real deal. The amount of training that you had to do to be at that level was next level, and it involved early mornings. So I believe it was 3-4 days a week that you had to be up at 5:30, and you were going down to the boathouse, and you would row until about 7 o'clock, and then you would go to the mess hall, you would go to the cafeteria in the morning, you'd eat, and then you would start your day at school. And then you would finish all of your classes and you would go out rowing again. So it was nonstop. And did I mention this was also 6 days a week? It was Monday to Saturday that they had school. And I kind of get it, because you have boarding students, so you want to keep them occupied. School as well on Saturday only went until 1 o'clock, I believe. So just after lunch, and then you were done. But I believe you were also rowing in the morning on Saturdays. So if you were going to do this, you had a very, very large commitment. It immediately was going to weed out anybody who wasn't that serious about it, because nobody wanted to give up their sleep, as rightly they shouldn't. It's important to a developmental mind. And I did. I wanted to, because I saw it as an out. I saw it as really, really exciting. Our crew that was coming together was really shaping up. We had some very, very strong guys who started in grade 9. We were only getting stronger in grade 10. And when we went on to compete in the national championship for grade 10, we succeeded. We won. I wasn't in a premier like the heavy 8, but we were in, for our age group, you're not quite yet senior, that's 11 and 12, but we competed in the heavy 4. I'm lying again. No, and we had our 8 as well. We went there and we won. We won 2 national championship gold medals in grade 10, and it was incredible. And the whole, to know peace. There's rare moments of peace like this, where you've been working on something for so long, and then as opposed to seeing it backfire, seeing it come to fruition, and to see your efforts validated by the success that you enjoyed, it's something that's kept me in life driving, even in the face of failure, to know what the payoff is like on the other side of all that effort. And it was incredible. What a rush. And to be in these circumstances where it was way more, the course was so professional, not like it wasn't amazing when we were out rowing on the ocean, but then this like Olympic level design courses that you had, it was the coolest thing, let alone that you were flying out there. You were staying out in the national championship area for like a week or so. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance surrounded with going out to this event that made it feel like a really big deal. And for somebody, when I think of how old you are at grade 10 and to be able to participate in something like that, yeah, it was not just how old I was. There was a real grandiosity to it that was real. And so we succeeded there. We cleaned up. We got the 2 gold medals. And then we went on to grade 11 and we did it again. We won 2 more gold medals. And then in grade 12, we went on to do it 3 times. So I had a pretty well decorated wall by the end of this. We were cleaning up, let alone this could almost be its own podcast to talk about the shenanigans that went on in this trip. There's a place in California known as Los Gatos, and a part of your training during the course of the year to get ready for nationals, if you're doing well enough, they had a Los Gatos training trip down in California. And this is one time I have to say this had to do with like decadence, because all the rowing clubs down in California that we toured when we were there, these were very wealthy people. They were like, you were getting billeted out to all these different families while you visited. And people were staying with like the founders of Starbucks and stuff. Like, it was crazy, the sort of wealth that you got exposed to when you went down for that training trip. And funniest story, I felt so bad for this guy. His name's Ryan Gallagher. He was a kid too. I could see at that time, I was like, if anybody's going to go on to save the world, you never met a straighter shooting arrow in all your life. And he came from this world helpful legacy family household where his dad was like one of the pioneers in like wind energy. Great guy. He's gone on now. I believe he's a doctor and he runs his own practice and he's saving lives. So Ryan's done well. Congratulations, Ryan. And I was billeted with him. I was billeted with the straight shooter, and we had this big talk before we went out for one of the training things. And it was to say that don't let us know that you're drunk. That was essentially the kind of like, these were the bullet points that you could take. It wasn't even saying don't get drunk, because this trip was like notorious for the amount that kids were getting their hands on alcohol and drinking. And I went in listening to, what was my theme song for, it was like Kylie Minogue, that I can't remember, Kylie Minogue, what was that song? Anyways, I was buying with like my brother's ID at that time. It was awesome. And all of us were told, basically, don't appear to be drinking, but if you drank, whatever, it's not a big deal, provided you're able to train at the same level that we would expect you to. And Ryan would never drink. That's not his way. It's not his way. And I was billeting with him, and it just so happened that he, poor bastard, ended up getting a vicious cold the night that we arrived. And so where everybody went out drinking, I think even the first night that we were there, Ryan stayed in like a good boy and got incredibly sick and felt like hell. And then in the morning, everybody else was hung to the 9, just destroyed from drinking, except for him, except everybody else had held their liquor and looked like they were in okay shape, except Ryan looked like hell. And we got this like brutal speech from the Irish coach about how people needed to care more about the team. And you could see him just staring at Ryan the whole time, inferring that Ryan was like the only guy who went out drinking and couldn't hold his shit together. When he in fact was the only guy who had actually behaved and not. I felt so bad for him. He got so run over at that point. Injustice. But that trip, like I say, I won't dwell there too long, because that's like another 40 minutes of just talking about that trip. It was incredible. Sad for me too. There were some sad memories there. Disappointing, I should say, not so much sad. But so in grade 12, we were going on to the nationals, and it looked like we were going to win at nationals, and we did again. So yeah, we went there. It's like we won nationals so many times. It actually just became like a blip where we were doing so well. But because we had performed so well, because we had succeeded over the years, and we had this cohesive team that had formed since grade 9, we were given the opportunity to go to, it's called Henley on the Thames. And to place this in context, if you've ever seen the movie The Social Network for the founding of Facebook, the rowing scene in that movie was filmed at Henley on the Thames, where this race takes place. And it's essentially the worlds of high school rowing. And because we'd done so well nationally, we were going to try for this. And there were not a lot of teams in the school's history that had ever gone to Henley on the Thames, like maybe one or two others in the school's whole history. And so this was huge, and we were going to go over. But as I mentioned in the past, it's not, my parents, they did fine. We did, I think, actually very well, considering I think my dad was supporting like 3 kids. My mom had a job, but it was to minimally contribute. Well, it was mostly the breadwinning was on his back. And so he's paying for 3 kids to be raised and fed and clothed and all this stuff. And so when it came to this, where you weren't charged extra to go to nationals, this was something that was included within the cost of generally paying for the school. If you wanted to, it was covered. But if we were going to go to England, which is where this takes place, then there was going to be another charge. And I just knew that this is not something, my parents are already like spread pretty thin for the fact that I had a bursary, and I know that it was significant in terms of helping us being able to do this, but we were not, as the expression goes, made of money. And so having another additional cost on top of the tuition that my parents were having to pay there, it was not in the stars for me to go to this thing. And I had no problem with that because I understood the way my parents were helping me as much as they could. So I went to the coach and I said to him that I can't do this. I hope you understand. I would love to, but with all due respect, it's beyond the financial capabilities of my family. And he kind of chuckled and said, "Oh, no, that's like, we'll figure out one way or another how this goes." And there was an incredible person that I know. He's actually visited me in Japan now about how many times? About 4 or 5 times. It's incredible. It's incredible how many times he's come out. He's one of the guys I rode with, and his family is a very, very successful family from Vancouver Island. And his dad, Vern, such a sweet old school name. Vern is the good king. And Vern had like 1 million businesses on the island and had like 6, 7 kids. He sent them all to Brentwood, all his boarding students. So it's quite expensive. And the guy legitimately had a heart of gold, where you get this impression nowadays, like if you're rich, you must be evil. But no, quite the opposite. This guy worked really hard, never was given any inheritance, and established himself as he was a dentist, but then went and started all these other businesses, and was an incredible person and raised this huge family and supported everyone, and is this huge pillar to the community, like a great man with money. And I'm basically 100% certain that it was him who covered the additional cost, because I never heard of it ever again. When I went there, they were like, "Oh yeah, it turns out you're covered, Dave. You can go, and there's no issue." And I was thinking, where's the money coming from? Because I don't think the school extended the additional money, but I'd heard that Vern had supported a few kids that if they were doing stuff for the school, like if they were going to do some major event or something that cost extra money, then he would occasionally duck in and offer some additional support. So I'm eternally grateful to, although unconfirmed. Here's another thing. The guy doesn't want any praise for what he did. It remained a secret who exactly helped me, but I'm pretty sure that it was Vern who did. And we went to England. It was another chance for me to travel, where I'd gone to East Coast Canada. I'm skipping some other crazy stuff that we did. There's like this other crazy race at UW in like Seattle, just south of Vancouver, called the opening day race, where you race down all these boats that are set up on either side of you to this like rapidly narrowing course. not going into that stuff, but the travel that we did to England was incredible. First time for me, never ever been there before, of course, and it was so cool. We stayed at I was billeted to some doctor's house. I don't know how they found all these connections and places for us to stay when we went over, but they did. And we competed, and if only for the cultural exposure of it, this was absolutely incredible. The environment that we were in was really, really, really cool. There were a couple like factors in it that made it more challenging, because obviously you benefit from familiarity in the sense that if you are rowing in the same boat, you get to know that boat, you know how it feels. And we had to, because we were going over to England, use a different one, so that kind of was to our detriment. But we did well. We got right up to first race. It was tough. The first race was tough. I don't think we beat them by many lengths, but it was like at least the length of a boat that we managed to take them out. And what's crazy about this course that you go down, if you see this movie, if you see The Social Network, it is a 2-lane race. You just go head to head. That's all you do when you race here. It's not some track that's open up to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different boats. It's just head on head, head to head, and you head down this super, super narrow path where if you were directly adjacent to each other, the chance of like knocking oars is actually quite high. So really, really intense if you've not taken a lead on your opponent. And we beat first opponent with some difficulty. Second opponent, we crushed. And then third opponent, not sure what it was. Again, you're only as strong as the weakest link in your chain. And I don't know if people were gassed or what happened, but it was a really tough race. And we lost. We ended up losing, I think, by... If it was like, I don't think more than 2 seconds and potentially under 2 seconds. And that crew that beat us went on to win the entire regatta. We were in the semifinals when we faced off against them. So a bitter disappointment. And given the numbers of failures that I've had in my life, perhaps I didn't need as much training with failures. I've gotten lots of that as I've gone along. But I think that it was useful in that way, that when you fail, you learn to get back up. And that was really useful, because I think for a lot of the people, more exceptional people than myself in that boat, who were, all they did was succeed. And to be fair, all they've done since is succeed. But perhaps because they weathered this loss, they've gone on to do so with more grace, where it was crushing. It was crushing to have come so far. And this was the ultimate result of 4 years, hopes and dreams. This was the ultimate point that we had built up to and failed. We had gone that far to not succeed, which was quite an ending to the story, I thought. But it was, would you go back and change a thing? Not at all, except for winning. It would have been sweet to win. And that is the story, of course, with some details removed during the course. I could have talked more about the training, specifically erg tests. Maybe I'll make that as a final note where to start off with the third episode of this as we continue through in the life of Dave Trippin. But that is all for now. Thanks so much for watching if you're on the channel. Thanks so much for listening if you're there at Apple iTunes or on Spotify. And we will pick up where we are leaving off now in the next episode of the Interstice podcast. Thanks again. Catch you later.